Hello, Kevin. How are you?
Doing very well. How are you, Finn?
Fine, thanks. So I wanted to discuss another article I wrote for the Mises Institute, which is connected a little bit to the discussion we had in our previous video about rights, property rights. Um, this article is an article that came out a uh, a couple of days ago on the Mises Institute website. So I'll just share just briefly the screen here. Um, so here it is. It's called Fight for Your Property Rights. Now, why do I call it like this? I call it like this because, the term fight for your rights is a term that is very well known, but it's a term that has been used by leftists, by socialists, right? To fight for your rights, to fight for your positive rights. As you know, we can make the distinction between positive rights and negative rights. Just very briefly, positive rights are rights where you basically ask for something, right? It's the freedom to get something like housing, healthcare, education, pension, even though these are not free, but that's how it's presented. And then you have negative rights, which are basically property rights. That is freedom from, to be free from the coercion of government, right? To make sure that your property rights are protected. So these are completely different kinds of rights, but they use the same word, and but they are very, very different actually. So I'm very much attached to the protection of property rights, and I believe that any society must have a kind of rule of law that protects property rights at the minimum in order to flourish and to be at peace and so on, right? And this is, for me, independent actually of the culture. And we can see in all cultures that this has been the case. Um, but what am I trying to do here in this article? First of all, this article is also a little bit educational, of course, and I'm not addressing only libertarians. It would be foolish to write articles to try to cater to people who are already convinced that property rights are key, right? So what we are doing when we write on the Mises Institute, it is to, of course, discuss with libertarians and try to bring the libertarian thought forward by proposing, let's say, new insights to concepts that have been known for a long time. This is what I'm trying to do in the second part of the article. The first part of the article is more, let's say, directed to a general public, where I try to explain that positive rights are actually always a counterpart, a contradiction to negative rights, because when you increase positive rights in society, you're always going to do that at the expense of someone else. So they cannot really be called rights in that respect. Positive rights are always going to be at the expense of negative rights. And negative rights, if you really are going to, let's say, fight for property rights, right? Fight for negative rights. It means obviously that you cannot at the same time have positive rights. So these two concepts are actually antagonistic. I think it's important to understand that. Um, and this is why also in the current welfare states that we have in the Western world, including in the United States, you have a lot of positive rights. You also have some negative rights, but the fact that you have so many positive rights are at the same time discriminating, and they are actually reducing negative rights. So this is the first point I'm trying to make in this article. It's not always made or is not always presented in this way, but I think it's extremely important to make the connection between positive rights and negative rights, and these two cannot coexist fully at the same time. It's a little bit like when the French revolutionaries tried to get us to believe, especially the Jacobins, right, that you can have both liberty and equality. Actually, equality initially was equality in front of the law, right, but not equality of outcome and not even equality of opportunity. But anyway, I'll let you make some comments if you want, and then I will get to the second part of the article after that. Okay?
Okay, yes. I approach it from a non-libertarian point of view, who, by the way, it supports the concept of property rights. My ideal society would be a bunch of small property owners with those rights. Where I get suspicious, say, is whenever I see an essay that has two clear binaries, a good and a bad. So, for example, positive rights are bad and negative rights are good. In my experience, there's always a coincidence of opposites, that these opposites often aren't really opposites. And I'll give you an example in geopolitics. For example, an EU foreign policy spokesman would say, well, democracy and authoritarianism. We're a democracy, therefore we're good, and we need to fight the baddies who are authoritarian. But if you really look at it, you'll see the EU has its authoritarian aspects, and that, say, Russia or China has their democratic aspects, maybe different than what we think of that. And so when I think about positive and negative rights, I don't know that they're antagonistic or separate, maybe to some extent. For example, you touch on my favorite subject, on crime and the protection of property from your fellow citizens. That to me is a positive right. You're demanding, or not you, but property owners are demanding that the state provide them with a police force, a judiciary, and a penitentiary system that is exceedingly expensive in order to protect their property rights. They're just demanding this. And the problem is, you made a good point that for consumption or that you can never have enough in terms of if you ask for something, you always want more. But it's the same with security. In geopolitics, we know about the security dilemma. So property owners are always going to demand more and more security for their property. And so for me, I don't see any clear distinction so much. Yes, in some cases you could say negative or positive, but certainly in that case, you have property owners demanding that that the state protect their property, which, as property concentrates, only creates a bigger state. You need more police, you need more judiciaries, you need more penitentiaries. And so another point that's not made in the article, but I always like to make, is the difference between personal property, which is, say, like your toothbrush, your car, your phone, even your house, versus private property, which is, to me, the means of production, which would be a factory, an AI data center, an oil well, agricultural land. Those are the means of production, and that's typically what's meant by private property. Sometimes even in the Marxist tradition, it got confused, and a lot of workers were like, no, we're not going to give up our toothbrushes. And so I just want to make that distinction as well, that obviously your toothbrush should be sacrosanct, but a factory or an AI data center, the problem is the owner of the AI data center can't protect it. He's not strong enough. If a mob comes and wants to take his AI data center, he can't protect it. He needs the state. He has to have a large, powerful state to protect his property. And so that's what I kind of see a little bit missing, these nuances missing when we talk about private, the state as being evil, versus it must protect property rights. So it's a necessary evil in a sense.
Okay, so a lot of points here. Firstly, I agree that not everything can be seen in a binary way. And you always need to be very, let's say, nuanced. And I'm one of those who is actually for a nuanced way of looking at society and politics. Nevertheless, for educational purposes and also for clarity, sometimes it's necessary to introduce such kind of binary concepts. And in this particular case, I think it's more straightforward than in other cases. Regarding private property, I do agree, and I think a lot of libertarians do not, but I do agree that private property can never be fully absolute, right? When you live in a society, you will have, there will always be some cases in which you can always find some cases in which it's not legitimate or morally acceptable to have an absolute property right. So I have some examples, but I'm not going to go into these examples now. That can be an interesting discussion for another time. I just want to point that out. But I'm not going into the definition right here in detail about property rights. That's why it's a separate discussion. Right now, what I'm trying to explain is that simply by having positive rights, you're automatically going to impinge on negative rights, on property rights. For example, you talk about security. This is a very interesting point because firstly, you know that a lot of the security that is provided, actually very well provided in, especially in the United States, is provided by private firms. So this is one point. Secondly, you know that security provided by the state has been degrading to a fantastic perspective. If you go into a French police station, you will be astounded at the level of bureaucracy, the lack of innovation, the lack of technology and IT that is being used. And of course, you have the motivational part, which is everything about regulatory capture and the corruption that can exist. So if you say that the population is demanding security from the state, I would be a little bit careful with this kind of announcement, right? What the population wants is security. Now, whether the state is providing that, the population wants security. Now, the population today doesn't have any other choice than getting security from the state. And however much they complain about the lack of security, there is a huge lack of security. This you can see particularly in welfare states, where the state has prioritized other positive rights rather than the regal, what you call the regal rights, the minarchist rights that a population can expect, right? So I think you need to consider these different points. But if I go then further on the second part of my article, and here it's a little bit more maybe dedicated to also libertarians as well as laymen. Because a lot of libertarians, what they do is that they conflate, actually many famous libertarians, right? They conflate property rights breaches by the state and by petty criminals or private enterprises, right? And for me, that's a fundamental difference. Firstly, they are assuming that a libertarian society or a free society must be a society without crime. We all know that's not possible, right? So if you build a political philosophy based on that, you are bound to be in the realm of utopia, So I cannot accept that. Secondly, we have to distinguish these two types of property rights violations for the following reason. That's why I call the article Fighting for Your Property Rights. This fight, this struggle is actually divided in two. One of them is the struggle for security, what you call the struggle for security. And this is actually getting rule of law. And we see that that's also not so obvious, right? We see that the rule of law is not something that you can take for granted. And basically, this means that you're expecting the state or any other kind of institutional framework to provide security and to make sure that your property rights are respected from the private sector, right? From civil society, from petty criminals, from hardened criminals, from enterprises that will try to breach their contract and get away with it, etc., right? Most people accept this kind of property rights breaches very easily. They fully understand that. When somebody comes to rob their apartment, they are fully aware that their property is being taken away. However, there's another property rights violation, and this gets back to really negative rights. This is when the state is constantly violating property rights. And this is, for example, two typical examples is taxation, which is not consensual and therefore must be a property rights violation, even though most people wouldn't say that, wouldn't agree to that. They call it a kind of semi-voluntary transaction. Yes, we haven't signed a social contract, but let's say that we implicitly agreed to it, so it's semi-voluntary because we have put our vote into the ballot box, etc. It's very fuzzy, all that stuff. But nevertheless, I consider that to be a property rights violation. And I'm trying to explain why it's important to think in this way. And then you have also inflation, which is the state's use of fiat currency, which doesn't need to be at all. You can very well have a state, which you had at the end of the 19th century, which is based on the gold standard and which basically doesn't inflate. So that's something that is fully possible within the realm of a society that we have had. So these are two the most egregious examples, right, of property rights violations by the state, right, where the negative rights are directly violated. And I'm trying to really show this through this article.
I, I, I mean, I don't got to odd economic theories, but I mean, I don't understand how the system would work without taxation. With a fiat currency, you actually don't need taxation. You really don't. They can just print the right amount of money and then manage inflation. So, but you have the danger of that with the gold standard. Then you have the danger of deflation. It can work under certain circumstances, but say towards the end of the 19th century, I think we had a 30-year recession, depression. Based on very hard money. And so, whereas the wealthy were okay, like more common people really suffered under that. And so, for a whole society, there has to be some kind of balance between inflation and deflation. So, in terms of whether it's property rights, I mean, that's one way of looking at it, but for the people who have money, but for the people who don't, they need to get by, and if they're starving at some point, that's gonna be a cost as well to the state or to the society, let's say. So,
Yeah, I think for the inflation, I think it's important to distinguish between the price inflation, which you are talking about, and what Austrian economics focuses on a lot is monetary inflation, right? The inflation of the
uh,
monetary mass. What I mean, so if you talk about price inflation, that's one thing.
wage inflation. I'm talking about more classic wage inflation, but yeah, there's cost inflation too. It's
Wage
very complex.
inflation.
The word
Okay, we
inflation.
can.
You're
I
right.
think we should have a separate discussion about inflation
Yes,
because
it's
it's a
complicated.
huge topic. But
Yes.
nevertheless, it's. I don't think you can put exactly deflation is when you talk about deflation, you're not talking about a reduction of the stock of money. You're talking about reduction of the prices, of the prices, and the
It could
real
go either
way.
way. You can't say that there's no monetary deflation. It could be either. As a
Could be,
population
but
grows,
I'm
if the
just saying
amount of
you
money
need
doesn't
to
grow, you have
define very
deflation.
clearly what it is that you're talking about, because when I talk about inflation, as it just did now, I'm talking about the states inflating the monetary mass, right? That means reducing the value of the currency in order to suit itself and the small ruling minority that is eating off the state, right? Generally bankers and so on. That's one thing. Then the consequence of that is price inflation, but price inflation is due also to a lot of other factors. Right? So anyway, let's discuss inflation on a separate topic. But nevertheless, I think it's very clear. I mean, even the Romans did the same. You're a history buff. You know very well that the Roman senators were scratching gold off the gold coins in order to, enrich themselves and make the Roman Empire survive another couple of decades. And this is classic robbing the people. And that's why I'm calling it as it is, right? It's a property rights violation. Even though it's more complex today, it's not fundamentally different from what actually the Romans were doing. And when you have this EU 2% inflation target, this is ridiculous. Actually, it's ridiculous. So anyway, I think that's the point I wanted to make. Is there something else I wanted to mention? I think that was it. Do you want to mention something else, or we
No, I think that's
prepare for our
you're
next
absolutely
meeting?
right. Inflation is a very complicated subject, and as is currency, the general economics behind it. I know a lot about it. I've written for several articles about it, so we could do a future podcast on that. That would be really interesting.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Finn.
Bye bye.